your brain is actually made to prevent you from having to think whenever possible because thinking is energetically costly. And so you'll opt for the easy or convenient thing. And so when that path is blocked, that path of least resistance is blocked, is when you can really become creative. And Murakami is obviously an international sensation as a writer. He decided to write in his late 20s, kind of on a whim. So to try to come up with a unique style, he has fairly limited English, if you've ever heard him talk. And he decided to write in English, he's a Japanese writer, and then reverse translate it back into his native language in Japanese. And that forced him to use really simple words and to try to express himself. That's where he came up with this unique kind of, for people who read him, love him or hate him, he has this mesmerizing rhythm that has made him an international superstar.
Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and today we have another person I've been looking to talk to for a long time, the journalist David Epstein, who is the #1 New York Times best-selling author of Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World, and The Sports Gene, Inside the Science of Extraordinary Athletic Performance. He recently wrote a book called Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better. And so we're going to talk all about that book mostly, but we'll talk a little bit about Range, which is one of my favorite books on athletic performance. Basically saying, hey, if you want to be great at a sport, you don't want your kids or whoever is training to just do that sport. You want to be like Roger Federer, who did a bunch of different sports, or Rafael Nadal, who did soccer and tennis, or Yannick Sinner, who is a very accomplished skier while also training for tennis. But Constraints is almost a follow-up, and in some ways, an answer to his own book, because Constraints is actually about saying, like, actually there is a time when you want to commit and actually block out all the distractions and actually put constraints in your own work and sometimes obstacles in your own way as a way to make yourself better. It's very intriguing. He's very smart, and he's got a lot of interesting studies and anecdotes that are going to make you really think here. So without further ado, let's jump into our interview with David Epstein. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, did I read that you were somehow involved in breaking the Alex Rodriguez steroid story?
I was very involved. I was an investigative reporter at Sports Illustrated, and with my colleague Selena Roberts, we did break that news.
Are you a native New Yorker? I know you went to Columbia.
Nope, Chicagoan originally.
So are you now no longer welcome in the city now at this point, or have people forgiven and forgotten?
Yeah, no. I mean, obviously at the time there was a lot of very nice mail from Boston and some not nice mail from New York, but I think in the end. I think it was a good trade for both teams. Like, A-Rod may have been cured of a little of his perfectionist syndrome. He had a very different image that he was trying to cultivate at that time. And for me, it helped me catch on in investigative reporting.
Well, don't spend any time looking at that Jalen Brunson contract. We don't need any.
Yeah, that'll be my colleague Pablo Torre now, who was my office mate at Sports Illustrated, who's now digging into those kinds of things. So you have to warn him.
We don't need any of that. Yeah, he's a native New Yorker, and I've noticed he hasn't had quite the same level of enthusiasm for following that trail, which I invite. We're recording this on Wednesday, June 10th, so we actually don't know how potent the Trump hex is. But I actually wrote a piece for the New York Daily News today about how we could potentially lift that hex, and so I'll link to that in the show notes for everybody.
Oh, that's great. I have to say, I found the Knicks very exciting, but the Spurs ordered 50 copies of Inside the Box, so that's kind of shaded my my loyalties here.
It's tough. Well, okay. You are a bit of a sports expert, but in a different kind of way. Your book, Range, is a book that I often find myself quoting. I actually think I might quote it in my upcoming book that I have coming out in September. But we'll come back around to that book because you have a new book that's all about constraints. And from what I understand, you implemented a bit of a constraint even in the act of writing this book.
Yeah, very much so. I did a number of things, both within a workday and over the course of the whole project. But two things that I did sort of in the macro scale for the project, one of which I took at the suggestion of a person I was interviewing for the book, was to write the press release for the book first before I started, which helped me clarify what the problem I was trying to take on and the audience I was aiming for. And then I spent a lot of time just doing research and not writing at all. And I compiled a 100,000 word note sheet That's much longer than the book itself. And then forced myself to make a 1-page structural outline. So read through that 100,000 words in a row, printed it out, and then on 1 page and 1 page only. And that forced me to prioritize ruthlessly what was going to be in the book and to find kind of logical ways. So I have this structure where there's a recurring story and sort of chapters that are thematically linked. And that all came out of the fact that I was trying to make things make sense on 1 page only and get in all the things I thought were interesting. And so I'd never done that before. So, after 2 previous bestsellers, I suddenly had a totally new process, but I found it amazing. I mean, one, it was engaging and interesting. I think it led me to clarify my priorities more about what was important. And because I had this architecture in place, even though I didn't start writing until much later in the process, once I did move into execution, it was much, much faster than I was used to, because I had this sort of clear boundaries that I was working inside of.
It's interesting. I had this physics professor in college who used to let us bring one index card into the test. And man, I used to get good I would actually take a copy machine. And because there was one of the tests I remember was lenses, where actually the diagrams are very helpful. So I would use a copy machine to keep shrinking down the images of the different lenses. But then a funny thing happened. Usually what would happen by the time I would sit the test is I spent so much time, and this is probably his intention, working on the index card that it was second nature to me. I didn't need to look at it most of the time because I had spent so much time trying to put everything on there.
No, that's great, right? It's like forcing you to focus on those things that matter, and then you're going to internalize that information anyway by that point.
I'm curious about your 100,000 word worksheet?
Note sheet. Yeah, I have it right behind this camera.
And what, as somebody who, I generally write an outline that I try to I basically try to make each step of a book writing process as easy as possible. So outline that's just bullets, and then I turn those into prose. What's in this worksheet? How do you format that?
Yeah, it's I call it my master thought list. And initially, because when I'm getting interested in something, I don't know that I'm writing a book on it yet. I'm just usually I start researching something for my own interest. And I'll start just saving things, on a document. Sometimes I use Rome research, but you can find just with a Word document. And I'll save a statistic that I think is interesting, or, a citation to a paper or a quote or whatever it is, or even my own thought. And as they start kind of orbiting a similar idea, I'll put them together under what I call a tag, which is like a topic heading. And then I'll seed that with a bunch of words that I think I would search for, like free association, if I ever need to search for it. And I end up with a bunch of these tags, and I move the ones that are more similar near one another. So I end up with this kind of map of ideas. And that can be, again, snippets from my own interviews or quotes that I've read, stats, citations, etc. And so I end up with this really long document that has thematically arranged facts and quotes and all that kind of stuff. And so then I sort of go through that.
And why constraints? Because, when you think about range, I'm sure you've heard this question a gazillion times, but it's when you think about range, it's almost on the surface, actually breaking down constraints in some ways. Instead of saying, hey, I'm going to constrain myself to one sport, I am going to become a bit of a generalist.
Yeah.
Whereas it seems like this book is a bit, I wouldn't say contradictory to, but it seems in some ways a response to that book or the discourse around it.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's very responsive to the most common comment or question that I got from readers, which was something along the lines of, okay, I've got these broad experiences and I'm really widely curious, like I talk about in Range, but I'm having trouble figuring out what to do, or how to channel that into something. And I completely put myself in that boat, right? Interested in a ton of things. My problem is never coming up with ideas of what to do. It's deciding which ones to execute and how to do that. And so I sort of saw it as the natural next question. I mean, I'm very much of the opinion that life is messy and we need to look at both sides of these coins. But one of the reasons I sort of opened the book with a guy who was a scientist who was an incredible polymath, his work touched every industry, but he needed these focusing constraints to sort of bring that power to bear into achievement. And so I sort of think the whole game of plotting out a career and a life that's interesting and where you can perform at your best and find where you best fit is this balance of when to go broad and when to have some boundaries that you drill into. And I think there's research kind of backing this up now. There was just this professor at Northwestern named Dashan Wong did this study of tens of thousands of careers, of people's careers. These ranged from film directors to artists and scientists. And what he found was that people tend to have hot streaks in their work. So their best work will come in sequence in many cases. And the pattern is that before a hot streak, you'll be in explore mode, basically like making little bets, trying different things, so trying different styles, sort of maybe working in small teams and seeing what's possible. And then kind of finding something to drill into. And it's what's called exploit mode. So you flip from explore to exploit. And that the way to plot a career is to toggle between those things. And I think that's tricky because I think most people tend to stay in one or the other. Like they're getting either increasingly narrow or maybe they're going broad and never finding that thing to narrow in on. Whereas the special sauce seems to be if you can toggle between them. So I sort of viewed Range and Inside the Box as companion books in that sense of these, like both of these frames of mind that you need to toggle between to do your best work.
You remind me of a conversation I had at a conference recently with an author that I know, but I can't say his name on air. And he was somebody who I've always looked up to. And I just, during the course of this conference, was like chatting him up and stuff. And at some point he confessed to me that he feels like he's kind of in a career rut. He's written a few New York Times bestselling books. And he's like, I just feel like the stuff I'm writing is kind of lame now. And I think let's start with writing, because I think like you actually have a lot of material in your book, and because I think when people hear constraint, it can feel a little esoteric. So I think we can go through a couple of different fields and domains and talk about what constraints could look like. Let's talk about, as writers, how you can think about constraints, because you have some really cool examples in this book.
Yeah, I mean, it depends kind of where you want to start. Which of the writer stories should we start with?
I'm a personal fan of Murakami.
Okay.
I really like that anecdote.
Great. Constraint. Okay, so that's a great example of a creative constraint. And to talk about another writer, a great example of what some psychologists would call the green eggs and ham effect, right? Which was named for a different kind of writer, Dr. Seuss, who famously wrote Green Eggs and Ham on a bet that he couldn't write a book with using only 50 words. And that led him to have to experiment with this rollicking rhythm because he couldn't be expansive with vocabulary. And so psychologists have shown that basically because our brains are wired for convenience, not for kind of thinking hard. In fact, as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham has written, your brain is actually made to prevent you from having to think whenever possible because thinking is energetically costly. And so you'll opt for the easy or convenient thing. And so when that path is blocked, that path of least resistance is blocked, is when you can really become creative. And Murakami is obviously an international sensation as a writer. He decided to write in his late 20s, kind of on a whim. And he entered a writing contest and he was trying to write a novel, and he was just like you said, he thought like the writer you were talking to, he thought he was writing was lame. So the style sounded like a million other people. There was nothing unique about it. And so to try to come up with a unique style, he has fairly limited English. If you've ever heard him talk, it's limited. And he decided to write in English. He's a Japanese writer, and then reverse translate it back into his native language in Japanese. And that forced him to use really simple words and to try to express himself very clearly with a very limited vocabulary, in some ways similar to Dr. Seuss. And that's where he came up with this unique kind of, for people who read him, love him or hate him, he has this mesmerizing rhythm that has made him an international superstar. So you can almost flip open any page of his books and have no idea what's going on in the story, but he has this rhythm to his writing that's totally unique and that I think made him a phenomenon. And so again, this was powered by this restriction where he took away the path of least resistance, the style, the easy, convenient style that came to mind when he had no restrictions in place, and forced himself somewhere else. And that's what creative constraints can do. As Picasso said, they can force you to make a kind of progress that you could never have envisioned in advance.
Yeah, and the Dr. Seuss example, he was given a list of 200 words, you said, and I don't even understand how that's possible, but they said you can only use 200 words, and then if I'm right, he picked the first two words that rhymed,
Yeah.
which were cat and hat.
Yeah. That was even before Green Eggs and Ham. So the thing that led to the Green Eggs and Ham bet, where he was bet $50 that he couldn't just do a book with just 50 words, was because he had succeeded in this previous assignment where they gave him a kid's vocabulary list and said, you have to pick about 200 words. And he gets frustrated because he looks at the list and sees there's very few adjectives. How am I going to write a book? So he makes this fine Seussian comment. He says to his wife, it's like trying to make a strudel without any strudels, which is kind of funny. And then he just sort of throws up his hands and says, I'm just going to take whatever the first two rhyming words are, and they're cat and hat. And that really was the development of that rhythm that he became known for. And it led to the bet of can you do this with even fewer words in Green Eggs and Ham? Of course he did.
I think about this now, I years ago started writing scripts, and, I mostly write books now, and articles, but I teach a writing class every Wednesday night. And one of my students is a guy who he's directed a really prominent documentary, and he does a lot of commercials and stuff. And he really wants to write a film. Mm-hmm. And I said to him recently, I was like, look, you could keep pitching projects that are just where the page is, limitless, right? You can write in whatever budget and whatever time period you want. Or you can look at Obsession and Backrooms and some of these new movies that were filmed for under $1 million and say, what space, time, setting, etc., can I just pick where I'm like, this is a 1, 2, 4 location movie, and try to write a movie around that, because it will force you to write something interesting, and it's more practically possible,
right?
That you could make this movie, you know? Yeah. So I think these kids are onto something. These kids who came up with low budgets and a tough Hollywood environment.
I mean, that's the entire model of Blumhouse films, right? Is they said, all right, we're going to pick, we're going to get interesting filmmakers, and we're going to give them a lot of creative control, but very circumscribed, because we're going to give them a really small budget.
Right.
And that forced them to do small number of locations, small number of speaking roles, limited movie magic. And it meant that they had to rely on plot and tension through the narrative. And those films are, Get Out and Whiplash and Paranormal Activity. These are films that returned thousands of % returns on the budgets that they that they had. And so it's not to say that, the Avengers isn't a good business proposition or whatever, but they built this hit factory totally based on, we're going to give you small budgets. It's going to force you into being more interesting narratively. And it's worked phenomenally well. I mean, the returns on those films are way higher than a lot of films with huge budgets.
Yeah, you think about some successful companies too, right? Like Amazon, the frugality of the low resource environment in which they started on certainly seems to be locked into their DNA. You have a great example, one of my favorite companies, especially in its early days, Pixar. They had this 3-pitch rule.
Yeah. Wait, before we say that though, since you mentioned Amazon, which I really appreciate, I was with Amazon recently, and it's so interesting because you'd be hard pressed to think of a company that could more have everything than Amazon, right? In terms of resources. And everyone in there is always complaining about how they're resource constrained.
Yes.
Because one of their values, they have this list of core values, is frugality. And so their teams are always pressed to do things on a shoestring budget. And that's what ultimately allows them to innovate and then scale. So they'll do this what some people call scout and scale, where it's you have this very limited budget. So people are really working on a shoestring to try to come up with some innovation. And that gives you a lot of sort of shots on goal to try things, and you're going to be resourceful. And then they take the ones that work and sort of scale them. So it's so interesting, because I don't think most companies are able to maintain that sort of startup frugal mindset when they get bigger, but they just hammer on it as one of their core values. So I think it's interesting that you mentioned that. But the 3 pitches rule, right, at Pixar, which again, I incorporated this into my writing. So if you want to talk about how I use this in my writing, but Pixar would force directors to pitch 3 story ideas because they found that if someone only pitched one, they would fall in love with it. And it typically wasn't their best idea. So this is in psychology known as the creative cliff illusion. You think your best idea comes first, but it actually comes later. And so this wasn't a recommendation, this was a guideline that they had to follow. And I think it's very much in that similar green eggs and ham effect mode of getting someone off the convenient answer. So to give you a sense, tell you how I repurposed this. When I was writing Inside the Box, for every chapter, I would write an opening, and you have to open somewhere, you got to get something down. Then I would cross that opening out and force myself to open in 2 other places, not just changing the wording, but open the chapter somewhere else with some other study or some other part of the story or whatever it is. And in 9 of the 12 chapters, I used either my second or third. And I hated doing it. It's painful, right? Not fun, because once you got started, like it's hard to get started and you want to keep that. So I think it was very much just like it is for the point for those directors is forces you off that thing that comes easily, because the fact that it comes easily is almost definitionally means it's not going to be the best. You haven't done your hardest thinking.
Yeah, I actually had a novel come out last year, and when I was writing it, I had a writing coach who told me to write multiple introductions for the book.
Interesting. Okay.
And so I did that too, and actually wound up using not the first one. Yeah. And it was, it's almost like Breaking Bad style, start from different points in the narrative and see what sticks.
Yeah.
And I've now been going through this exercise with my writing class, because what I've told them is the most important writing by far that almost dwarfs everything that comes after it is just the first page of your book. Like most, obviously with time, as you know, with your books, and I've certainly have a hunch with mine, is people, the percentage of people who make it all the way to the end is so small compared to the people who like are sort of surveying the front matter of your book and the first couple pages, and they don't get to the back if they're not hooked by the first. So why not like skunk works it, come up with a lot of different ideas,
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you know what works though? Like, because I find that sometimes if I'm writing multiple intros or whatever, I'm like, because I've been at that point too comfortable with the material, I have a hard time knowing what's actually most captivating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one reason why outside eyes are really helpful. So having an editor or just readers who can help you, but also having taste. I mean, I remember being early in my writing career, I transitioned out of science into training to be a scientist into being a writer, and I was not doing my work was not what I wanted it to be. And at the time, I didn't quite know how to get it to where I wanted it to be, but I knew that it wasn't what I wanted it to be. So I had enough taste to know that it wasn't what I wanted it to be. I just didn't know how to get
what is
there.
it? The Ira Glass quote. Have you ever heard the Ira Glass quote about this? He talks exactly like this. It's almost word for word your experience. He says there's a period of time where your abilities have to catch up to your taste, and it takes a long time, is what he said.
Something interesting. Like that. Okay, that's great. I'd look up that. That's funny. I mean, I've worked on a piece with him. I never heard that before.
It's a great quote. I actually quoted it in my book that's coming out in September. Because it's a frustrating experience because you just know it's not there, and that awareness is maddening.
Yeah, but I think reading a lot helps, right? Like I'm a nonfiction writer, but I read a ton of fiction because I think it improves your taste, gives you a sense of what's possible. Because nonfiction tends to be a lot less structurally diverse, I would say.
Yeah.
So I think that's reading a lot helps you develop that taste also, and reading diversely.
Well, let's move into the world of restaurants and David Chang. And I'll give you an example outside of restaurants that this reminds me a little of, which was I used to be a school principal. I started a charter school, and our first 2 years we were in the night school campus of Tennessee State University in downtown Nashville, which meant we had very limited space. And we had to break down our classrooms every afternoon and turn them back into college classrooms, which means we couldn't put a lot on the walls. We didn't have tons of space to do all kinds of enrichment activities and all that and whatever. And I think that space was so conducive to what were some pretty incredible results with kids who were coming in multiple grade levels behind, because we really had to focus on academics anyway. We had It just created a distraction free environment, also a very safe environment because it was a very limited physical print.
Mm.
Extremely clean schools where we didn't, because couldn't put things on the walls and order all kinds of stuff. We didn't have any of that to think about. So we were just like, we have this space. We're going to come in. We can't do much else except learn our academics. That's what we're going to do. It was an L-shaped hallway. In 1 minute, I can walk and see into all the different classrooms and see everything that's going on and just have an awareness of what's happening. And I compare that to what my colleagues in schools would call the edifice complex, which is, there was often, my friends down in New Orleans were starting to get these amazing buildings with the FEMA money. And they were going from trailers to the FEMA buildings, which were gorgeous. And one person after another was telling me how much harder they found it to run those schools in these beautiful, huge facilities, because everybody was more spread out. Everybody was obsessed with the buildings and what they could do and all that. And they started to get their minds off of what was their core and their DNA.
I mean, constraints have an amazing way of forcing you to clarify your priorities. And when you're not forced to clarify your priorities, you sprawl, right? I was just before we got on this discussion, reading an article about the Indian Space Agency, ISRO, I think it was called. And they made a probe that went to Mars for less than the budget of the film Gravity, right? And because they couldn't shoot this probe to Mars directly the way the US did, they had to come up with these creative solutions where they had it sort of orbit the Earth multiple times, building up speed in something that sort of looked like a slingshot, and then kind of go off on its way to Mars. I'm like, this is incredible. This is like incredibly brilliant. And so they did it for way, way less than we've done similar things for. And they absolutely never would have come up with this if they hadn't been forced to. Actually, I don't want to go on too much about space. I was an astronomy minor in college, so I love space stuff. But one of the first readers of Inside the Box was a guy named Ed Hoffman, who was the first chief knowledge officer at NASA. It's kind of like a head psychologist at NASA, basically, responsible for organizational learning. And he said, I have to tell you about this mission called L-Cross, where the engineers ended up with about half the time and budget that they wanted. So what do? Well, first they complain. And then one of their team leaders says, well, look, if we were going to get this done anyway, how would we do it? And that sort of sparks the team, right? This challenge. And they say, well, we have to borrow tech. And so they take imaging equipment straight from Army tanks, engine temperature sensors plucked right out of NASCAR, and they build a probe that confirms water on the moon. And they just never would think about that otherwise, right? It really kind of narrows your focus to like, what affordances does this environment give me? What's possible with just what we have here? And I think we probably don't do that enough, right? It's like when you have a lot of resources, you can do path of least resistance. You're not forced to clarify your priorities, and you're not launched into that kind of productive exploration.
You had that interesting example of David Chang in his restaurants, where there was something wrong with the sort of heating and cooling system. What was going on here?
This is amazing because he's obsessed with constraints, right? Like, because he says his whole career was constraints. And when in Momofuku-ko, like before it was, 2 Michelin stars or whatever it was basically this tiny, dingy little restaurant. And it was so small that in the summer, the HVAC system would, let's say in the winter, the hoods, like the cooking, would pull out the heat and the place would be too cold. So they couldn't use the HVAC system that way in the winter. So instead, they focused all on hot dishes so they could have like the stoves and everything running to heat up the place. And they ended up coming up with this sort of brilliant menu. And then in the summer, it was the reverse, where if they had the stoves all running, it would be too hot in there because it was such a small space. And so they focused only on cold preparations during the summer. And as David said, it forced them to come up with these innovative menus that they never would have come up with otherwise.
Now, the obvious sort of question around all this is like, what's a good constraint versus a bad constraint, right? So we talked about like obviously if you grew up in North Korea, there's a lot of constraints on your life, almost none of those is actually going to be the good kind.
Yeah.
So how do we recognize and or design the ones that are the right fit and the right balance?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of art to that. Like even that story I told about that NASA mission, if they had gotten a quarter of the time and a quarter of the budget,
Yeah.
would it still have worked?
Right.
Maybe not.
Right.
And we know there are things like probably the most familiar type of constraint to the most people is a deadline. And research shows that a deadline can actually be helpful or harmful for problem solving and creativity, productivity, and it depends how it's used. So if it leads you to multitask, like to urgently try to get everything done, it ruins productivity and creativity, causes people to be stressed out because toggling is stressful. But if it leads you to monotask, or if your boss is kind of protecting you, it's like now it's time to just focus on this. Then people's productivity and their creativity and creative problem solving surges. So even within that type of constraint, there's a lot of nuance in how do you actually use it. I think in general, when you think of a constraint, there are a few ways it can be bad. I mean, the word is practically synonymous with something that's frustrating, right? So in research on things like making mechanical inventions, some people are given 100 pieces and told to make whatever they want, they will be much less creative than people who are told you can only use these 20 from that set of 100 and you have to make a piece of furniture. But if those people are then told you can only use these 20 and you have to make a chair, so it's really specified, then that's where you see the creativity fall off a cliff again. So I think when you're setting the constraints, if someone says, could I still surprise myself? And the answer is no, then it's gone too far. I think the other issue is that often people view constraints, and sometimes rightfully, as these dictates that are just infringing on what they could be doing. And so I think even when constraints can be potentially useful, there's a leadership challenge of how they are implemented. So I actually saw something pretty cool with a CEO that I was tailing for a little while, where he was with this company that had gone through explosive growth, had probably grown a little faster than they should have, and maybe was going to have to come back a little bit. And he said, he got his team in a room and he said, all right, I want to do this exercise I call the legacy constraint, where let's say we were going out of business in 2 years and nobody knew it but us. And they weren't, but if they didn't change, maybe in 5 or 10 years or something. Let's say we're going out of business in 2 years and our clients don't know it. We can't tell them, only we know it. What would we do differently? And people started saying, oh, I'd stop worrying about this little small thing, or I would stop focusing on X and focus on Y because that's where I think my real talent is. Or that's where I think the real value is, et cetera. And so the end of the meeting was, okay, well, let's try that thing. Why don't you try focusing on that? Why don't you stop worrying about that small thing? And so changes were going to have to be made. But I think this was a brilliant way for him to, one, get intel from the ground level about what those things could be, and to make people feel included in that process of putting some constraints in place. And so a big part of bad constraints, I think, often is how they are handed over to people so that they feel much more like a form of punishment than like it did with the L-Cross team, where I said, well, if we were going to get this done, how would we do it anyway? This could be a challenge to be creative, right? Like that Apollo 13 film scene that everybody knows, right? It's a challenge. So yeah, if it's so restrictive that you're telling someone what to do and how to do it, that's a problem. But I think the bigger problem is usually just that it makes people defensive because it's not sort of deftly handled from a leadership standpoint.
And, I think you mentioned monotasking, right? Like one of the, which I think also was the sort of subject of the Atlantic article you kind of pulled out of some of this material. Mm-hmm. And obviously I think it's never been harder to monotask, and people are doing it less and less and less. There's so many obvious things that everybody knows. Like some of this is dieting, right? It's like I don't think the problem with dieting for most of the people in my life is knowledge of the core problem. Like sure. You put a vegetable in front of somebody and then you put McDonald's in front of them, they know the difference.
Yes.
But you said something, I forgot which interview, it might've been the Adam Grant interview, that I thought was interesting, where it's like, you talked about research on self-interruptions. And I think you said this might've been your favorite piece of evidence in the entire book. Let's start there because you wound up at a
Sure.
solution that actually tracks something I've been trying recently.
Yeah, favorite and maybe more accurate to say scariest also. I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
interesting. um, but this section of the book was focused on the work of a psychologist named Gloria Mark. And Dr. Mark started studying people at work about 25 years ago. And at that time, she found that people were switching tasks about every 3 minutes on average. And by 2012, it was about every 75 seconds. By 2022, it was about every 45 seconds. Seems to have plateaued there for the last few years. So maybe that's where we are for a while, but unclear. And turns out this is terrible for people's productivity. So the more times you toggle, the lower will be your productivity at the end of the day. And what more recent research has shown is it's terrible for your stress levels, like measured by physiological measures like heart rate variability, immune function. The more you toggle, the worse it is. And the scary research I was referring to was Dr. Mark found that our attention gets trained. And so if you're interrupted by toggling or notifications or even other people, whatever it is all day, and then you say, well, but now I'm going to focus, you won't be able to because you will self-interrupt with intrusive thoughts at the rate to which you've become accustomed, as if we have this internal distraction barometer that gets used to a certain cadence and wants to maintain it. And so, you'll start thinking like, there's that feed I want to check. I forgot to respond to that thing. So you won't be able to really focus. So if you want to, you have to retrain your attention. Fortunately, you can do this fairly quickly. But one of Dr. Mark's main recommendations is to start working in blocks. So she found that people, and this is a couple of years old, so maybe it's higher, but that people check email on average 77 different times a day. So at work, that's not 77 emails, 77 different checks where you've gone to something else and come back. And you don't want to be doing that. Maybe you have to answer all those emails, but can you do that in 1 or 3 or 5 blocks throughout the day where you're just doing email and then you're not doing email and you're just doing something else next? So it requires a little more organization where this is what I'm doing during this half hour or 2 hours, and setting up those blocks through the day to reduce your number of toggles, basically. And it'll be hard at first because all this stuff that you should be doing pops in your head. So you want a pad next to you where you can write down the thoughts as they come up, called cognitive outsourcing. There's one other thing that I've used that I've found kind of helpful that I'm starting to refer to as the Hemingway principle. So maybe you know this one, since obviously you know a lot about writing, but Hemingway would stop in the middle of a thought, basically, when he was writing, or sometimes in the middle of a sentence each day, at the end of each workday, because he said, when I start in the morning, I now know exactly where I'm starting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I find this difficult. Like you go in the beginning of the day, so, well, which of the things should I start with? And there's something called the mere urgency effect in psychology, where people will prioritize things that feel urgent over things that are actually important, even if the important is obviously a better use of their time. So now I make my last move of every workday to write down the spot where I will start the next day. And that's kind of silly, but I find it tremendously helpful so that I'm not, because otherwise I get drawn into feeds and email if I haven't specified where I want my attention to be at the start of the next day.
I think so. I've been battling this self-interruption issue for a while now, and the solution I've come to, that when I'm completely in fidelity to it, I almost unquestionably have good days. It tracks a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. Number one, it's time blocking, but not in the Cal Newport sort of way. And I respect the hell out of him, but I have a hard time being like, here's my exact day and every little piece of the day. Wednesdays tend to be that way because I tend to record a couple things on Wednesdays and teach a class. But on days where I have extensive white space, I find it hard because then I go off track and then things get chaos. What I instead do is I track the amount of 20-minute blocks I do. I actually have a physical like hourglass thing over here, and I don't allow myself to do anything other than the thing I'm doing during that time. And I have a little piece of paper next to me for the day where I both make tick marks for each of the blocks I have, and I try to see how many days, like how my days compare to the next. And I have a journal that's not like my normal journal, but it's I track every time I would have stopped and didn't. Like it's almost like call it like good decisions journal, where I'd be like, I had the urge here. And it almost is like, it's almost an amusing experience to me because I think about the addictive nature of
Hmm.
the interruptions. It's like, oh, I would have just checked email there. And then you, at the end of the day, you see this list and you're like, this is crazy. The
Yeah.
amount of times I would have went to the New York Times and the Atlantic and my iMessages and my, my email inbox, like you're talking about.
Yeah.
And
You
I
haven't even
found
mentioned
that
social media,
combination
right?
works really well, you know?
Yeah,
And
that's really cool. I really like that system. I've used a time timer sometimes. You know what those are, where it's like a little, just a little clock that sits on your desk and it has a colored disc. Again, this is so silly, but it works. And you can set it for a certain amount of time and you see the disc disappearing.
hmm.
So it's a very easy way to process very quickly. And then when I do my blocks, I'll use that time timer and having that, like, we know it's important for people to visualize like trade-offs and things like that. And so I like that time timer, but I really like that idea of putting down the times that you would have been interrupted. Then you really start to see, because people in these studies, like in the work of Dr. Mark and others like her, when you ask people how many times they've toggled or how many times they were interrupted during the day, they're not even close to right compared to when she has like monitors on their computer and cameras on them and all that kind of stuff. Right. So people really underestimate how much switching they're doing compared to when there's objective measures.
I do think like a running list, because I think the way people think about journaling, generally speaking, is like some one-time act throughout the day, which I do think is very valuable in and of itself. But this is a different kind of journaling. And funny enough, right before this, I just interviewed Ben Carlson from the Animal Spirits podcast, who has a book called Risk Reward. And one thing he talks about, he actually doesn't talk about in the interview I had with him, I don't think, but he has talked about it on his podcast, is that he recommends this for people who like to predict the market for a living. And he kind of broadens the perspective. He's like, every time you are making a call, we're at the peak, we're at this or that. He's like, you should keep a record of all your predictions, whether they're said out loud or just in your head, and then compare that against actual
Oh, yeah.
performance. And he's
Yeah.
like, what you will find is how insanely wrong you are most of the time.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
uh,
I mean,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No,
I
no,
didn't
no.
interrupt you.
I have a different direction I want to take us. So respond to that before
I
we
mean,
continue.
this shows up in Philip Tetlock's famous work on forecasting like crazy, where one of the most important things that the so-called super forecasters do, who get better at predictions, is keep track.
Right.
And not only they keep track, but if they make a wrong prediction, they do, for the stat heads out there, the Bayesian updating. They say, okay, something about my view was wrong. I should tweak a little bit, not a lot, because there's also randomness. I should tweak a little bit in the direction of what this wrong is telling me. And then they just do that a million times and they become better predictors. But when I first read his research, at the time I was at Sports Illustrated and I was one of the people who would work on this special section that only went to a small number of subscribers for fantasy football. And we would do these fantasy football drafts, right? And I was like, man, I'm so good at this. Cause I remember I picked some Division III guy who becomes a contributor. I'm like, I'm amazing at this. And then after reading Tetlock's work, I went, because these were all recorded in the special section Sports Illustrated, I went back and reconstructed the actual picks. And I'm like, holy cow, I'd forgotten every terrible pick I made and had only remembered the really good ones. And I'm like, I had some good picks, but I also had some real stinkers. And those ones just got erased from my memory. And that's apparently, just a typical human bias. So if you
That's
want to get better,
unbelievable.
you really should record what you're saying.
One thing that stands out to me in the constraints, like the manufacturing of constraints world, because obviously if you have constraints, you just have them. Like, so like sometimes, we all have money constraints, some people more or less. There's certain constraints that you just are given. And your book can help people just have a positive outlook on them. But you also, when you're manufacturing constraints, I think one thing that I think really helps is many feedback loops. So if you were to say, I work at a company and we have one shot at making the widget, right? Well, how you construct the constraints around how you build that, to the extent you're manufacturing them to create a better environment, are much higher stakes if you have one opportunity, and that's existential, right? Versus if you're a writer, for example, of scripts or whatever, I could write multiple scripts in the next year, right? And so each time I sit down to write a script, I could give myself a new constraint and see how it goes. And the error rate there, just like with athletic training, right? If I'm coming up with new ways to train, or to drill certain things. If you have many reps, the constraints you can learn. You have more data to learn from, and they're lower stakes in each round. You know what I'm saying? And that seems like a very helpful environment.
For sure. And I mean, I think that shows up in some great creators of sort of how they, analogous to what you're saying, try to keep things as small as possible for as long as possible. I mean, to go back to Pixar, we were talking about again, they would keep directors in small teams in story development for years where they're getting constant feedback, like almost daily feedback. And that seems kind of inefficient, but the costs only explode and the momentum only becomes difficult to change once they move into production. So staying in that small space where they're experimenting, I remember Ed Catmull, the co-founder, was telling me about the development of Inside Out. And he's like, originally it had all these characters. And so they would try a story and then get feedback that there's too many characters. It's getting too complicated. So they took out like Schadenfreude was one of the original characters they took out. So it was like going through this cycle of you're trying it out and we're keeping it small. Or like Tony Fadell, who I write about, the lead designer of the iPod, he said, we're going to make first version in 10 weeks. That's all you got. And then we're going to stop and collect lessons. And it's called design freeze. Like you stop and collect lessons and do it again. So I think a lot of these great creators, they really try to find ways to keep things as small as possible, as long as possible. So you can go through that sort of experimental phase without moving into big production. And actually, there's this Oxford professor named Bent Flubier, Danish guy, who spent his life studying projects. And what he finds is that most projects go over time and over budget and don't deliver what they promised. What he sees as the theme for projects that don't work out, basically, is what he calls think fast, act slow. So it's like you skip straight from idea to big execution instead of doing that kind of experimentation and like setting the boundaries. So you're inevitably going to learn lessons once you move into execution. And if you haven't had that slow time of where you're defining the boundaries, you're going to learn those lessons painfully because now it's got momentum and it's hard to shift. That's why he calls it think fast, act slow, because you sort of skip that small phase and you'll end up acting slow because it will be so hard to change momentum once you're so committed, even though you didn't know if you were committing in the right way yet.
Yeah, this reminds me of, I forget the guy's name who wrote the book about NVIDIA. I had him on a couple months ago. And one of the things he writes about is, and I'm botching the sort of details here, but NVIDIA created a simulation that instead of building the hardware, which was everybody else was doing, they simulated it. And that was one of their they had to do it. I forget the story exactly. They were running out of money and they had one shot at some major innovation and they wanted to get to market. Basically, speed was of the essence. They had to get to market before all their competitors. And so what they did was they simulated their chips. And that became the NVIDIA DNA, is that so much of their innovation happens not in the physical space, but in,
interesting,
which is something you see more and more common now, but back then it was more innovative. Well, before I lose you, bringing it back to sports, I'm thinking about, well, obviously sports are, I forget the saying, it's like almost the willing acceptance of arbitrary constraints or something is like what sports are, right?
The
like
voluntary acceptance of unnecessary obstacles. That's a philosopher Bernard Suits.
Because that's a different quote, but I like that too. But you think about constraints too, like how big is a diamond, like a baseball diamond, right? How tall is a hoop, right? And I'm curious about like if you have ideas for new constraints you put on things. I came up with a couple. One is in tennis, going back to older rackets, wooden rackets, because it would actually slow down the pace of the game, make it more interesting. So the serves and everything else are less fast. Two is a 3-point budget for basketball. So you can only shoot a certain amount of 3-pointers. And so you have to budget them.
That's funny. The first thing I thought of when you said this was I would have to do the exact calculation to see what it was, but take away like 1/10 of a point for every 3-pointer you miss or something like that, and just like change the calculus. Because we could be analytically driven and like really see what it would take to make a 3-pointer like barely better, than a 2-pointer.
Or like scarce, right? NFL. This one I'm not sure about, but it'll be interesting to experiment with in the preseason or something. Is you limit the number of total plays you can have to get from A to B. Now that would have the consequence of a lot more passing, I would imagine. But
trick plays, maybe.
I don't know if this is quite constraint driven, but it has driven me nuts. Is penalty shootouts to me seem a crazy way to decide a soccer game.
Yeah.
I really like the idea that I'm not the first or the millionth to come up with this one, to remove one player at a time in overtime, maybe every minute, every couple minutes, whatever, until you only basically are down to one-on-one, which that would end pretty quickly.
Interesting. My first thought when you said penalty was to go smaller field. But
I like that
would
too.
be interesting because it does seem like, smaller field, and you would have fewer players if you went smaller field anyway, like 7-on-7, but small field or something like that, or small goal and take out the goalie.
Right.
You have people playing futsal. They all grew up playing futsal anyway.
Right.
Yeah, I think that would be fun. I mean, you mentioned baseball, by the way, and I think baseball got some of its design, like the foul lines, because a New York baseball club moved across the river and had to make foul territory right up against the water, right? So some of that came out of physical constraints. I think all those are fun. I mean, I was a national level track athlete, 800-meter runner. And, we've got this are you aware that there's like the first sub 2-hour marathon was just run recently?
I'm not aware. Yeah.
And that was a limit that we didn't think would be crossed for a long time, but it's also very clearly a result of some technological changes.
Like shoes
for sure, that have this new energy return foam and carbon fiber plates in them and all this stuff. But also,
by the way, I'm going to ask you now anyway, what's the best running shoe out there? Like,
I have no idea. I have no idea.
I want some gear. Basically, I want some gear that will convince me that I can run faster.
If you want shoes that are going to make you faster, like you could look at Nike's Vaporfly. But if you just do super shoes, like Adidas has the ones that just broke the 2-hour marathon. It's this like sort of proliferation war that's going on. The ones that the two guys broke the 2-hour marathon were wearing, those aren't readily available, but there's some that are like the next model down that you can get as a consumer. And that's interesting. There's also this fueling stuff where there are these gels that allow people to take on a lot more carbs than they ever would have been able to stomach in the past. And so you're not seeing people blow up in the marathon the way they used to. And as someone who loves running and track, I just think it's like the sport is shooting itself in the foot. Like, you used to see people have to gamble and go out front in the marathon, and then they would blow up because they'd run out of, energy basically. And now you never see that. And it's so much more boring. So I would love to see, like, you always, how would athletes compare to eras of the past? Track and field would be a great opportunity to, let's put all these people like Jesse Owens, where they have to take a gardening trowel and dig their little starting holes in a cinder track, and see how fast they really are. Then we could really compare just what's the difference in the athletes. So, we just had these enhanced games where like the athletes were encouraged to dope.
I was following that.
How can we not have the unenhanced games? Like, this would be amazing to compare them back to athletes of the past. So I think that would be a lot of fun.
I like that. I have one other sort of sports idea that I don't know if it fits neatly within constraints. It's actually probably the opposite. Is I'm surprised we have not seen a team in the NFL run two quarterbacks at the same time consistently. Like I just don't understand why that's not more of a thing. Because you have these running quarterbacks, Josh Allen, my guy, and Lamar Jackson and all that. It's not, Lamar Jackson would be a good running back on his own. So it's like, what if you had Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson in a backfield? That would be a very hard thing to deal with, and I imagine it would open up all kinds of possibilities. And I'm surprised we haven't seen that yet.
Maybe I don't know what the analytics case is for it, but one thing I'll say is that from having been around sports for a long time, starting with when I was at Sports Illustrated, things that teams should try often take an incredibly long time, even once it's obvious. Like all this 3-point shooting now. That was obvious in the analytics.
Well, there's social pressure too. This gets to the Gladwell sort of underhanded, like the Barry point about like underhanded free throws.
Right.
Like if Mitchell Robinson did that,
he'd
probably be better, but it's just too much embarrassment.
Yeah.
Ben also, the Ben Carlson talks about goalies in soccer and penalty shootouts should be standing still more often, because if you go left, you go right. A lot of time, like there's a certain percentage of times that the player kicking the ball is just going right down the middle, but goalies never stand still because it seems like you're doing nothing. So like the social pressure against doing that. So I love those inefficiencies,
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the going for it on fourth down more often, they're still not doing that as much as they should, but these things have been obvious for a while, but it sort of takes someone with social capital, I guess, to do it, whether it's Steph Curry or whatever it is.
Right.
And so some of those things may be useful, but just nobody's kind of wants to be the pioneer and try it and see it blow up and all those things, right? Because you look at Pete Carroll, right? Remember the famous call in the Super Bowl where they throw near the end zone, and obviously it turns out disastrous, but it was a good play call.
Yeah.
Like it went wrong, but it was a good play call. But it's hard to live with that, when you could have just done the status quo thing, even if it was less likely to work out in the end.
Well, David, it was great catching up. Everybody listening, go out and get Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better. You could also go out and get the Sports Gene and Range. David, wonderful stuff, man. And we'll put all the links in the show notes for everybody.
Thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. Remember to rate, review, subscribe. We love seeing those reviews. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe. But you here on YouTube, but you could also subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if it's the reverse, if you're listening to some podcasts, go subscribe on YouTube. Have a great week, everybody.